Thank you so much for joining us all here today. This is the first ever meeting of SAADA's Our Stories book club, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So just to introduce myself again, my name is Samit Malik. I'm SAADA's co-founder and executive director, and I'm joined by my colleague Niv Karthikeyan, who is SAADA's special projects coordinator. And Niv was a huge part of this book being published this year. We've been working on this book for many years, as some of you have been part of that process for a long time as well. And I'm so excited that the book is now out there with you. And this is our opportunity to bring readers and to bring community members from across the country together around the book. And Paul is holding it up, and I'm going to hold up a copy too, for those who don't have it yet. So just a few logistical details before we get started. The first is that you'll see that the event is being recorded. It's only recording active speakers. So if you're not actively speaking, you're not going to be recorded. I'll also, if you're in a position where it's comfortable to do so, as I mentioned before, would love to have you turn on your camera just so we have a sense of being together. Live captions are enabled for the meeting. So if you need to turn them on, you can click on the live captions option and click show subtitles, and you'll have access to live captions that way. And Niv will drop in the chat instructions on how to enable live captions as well. So as I mentioned, this is our very first book club meeting for Our Stories. This month, we're going to be covering chapter 1. And then in subsequent months, we're going to be covering the following chapters in the book. Chapter 2 will be in January. We're going to take December off for the holidays. Chapter 2 will be in January, and then chapter 3 in February, and so on and so forth. So I hope you'll be able to join us in future meetings as well. And of course, please invite friends and family members and loved ones to join us to be part of the conversation going forward. I want to thank a few of our sponsors who helped to make this book club possible. The Society of Southwest Archivists, Asian American and Diaspora Studies at Duke University, Department of American Studies at UMBC, Pigott-McCone Endowed Chair, English Department and Asian Studies Departments of Seattle University. If you'd like to join, if your business or your department would like to join as a sponsor to help support SAADA's work in the book club, feel free to get in touch with us. You can email me, and I'll put my email in the chat. It's just samit@saada.org. If you don't have a copy of the book yet, you can order one at saada.org/ourstories. And while you're there, I'll encourage you to check out our new merchandise collaborations with 3 incredible South Asian American artists, Hanifa Hamid, Ragini Agarwal, and Safwat Salim. I'm today wearing our new Garam Masala t-shirt that was designed by Safwat, and Niv is wearing our Arrival t-shirt designed by Hanifa. And I also want to finally invite all of you to join us on November 17th, which is a Wednesday, for a 30-minute, what we're calling a 30-minute midday blowout, a celebration about a really important announcement about SAADA's future. And so if you're able to join us, Niv will add the link to RSVP in the chat. So our goal now with Our Stories is to get this book into the hands of as many young South Asian Americans as possible. The book was published in August, as you all know, and now there are nearly 1,500 copies of Our Stories in schools, libraries, and homes all across the country. Today, we're joined by 5 incredible contributors to Chapter 1. We're joined by Dr. Seema Sohi, Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, and the editor of Chapter 1, and the author of the stories in that chapter about the Gadar Party and the Komagata Maru. We're joined by Dr. Rajender Kaur, Professor of English and Director of Asian Studies Program at William Patterson University, and the author in Chapter 1 of Sikh Keesar's Petition to Benjamin Franklin. We're joined by Dr. Vivek Bald, scholar, writer, and documentary filmmaker, and author of Jumping Ship. We're joined by Dr. Paul Engelsberg, retired faculty member at the School of Education at Walden University, and author of the Bellingham Anti-Hindu Riot. And we're joined by Erica Anderson, an award-winning filmmaker and granddaughter of Kartar Dhillon, whose story, The Paris Beak, appears in Chapter 1. It's going to be an amazing conversation, I have no doubt. I'll lead a Q&A with the authors and leave about 10 minutes or so at the end for questions from the audience. But please, in the meantime, if you have questions about the chapter, either generally or about this period of time, pre-1923 South Asian American history, please feel free to add them to the chat, and I'll try to incorporate them into the conversation as much as I'm able. And if you have any requests or suggestions about future book club meetings, please reach out to us. We'd love to know how to make this a dynamic and valuable space for our community to come together. So please email me if you have any feedback or input on the book club and what we can do going forward. So I'll start, Seema, with you, if you don't mind. So I thought it would be helpful to maybe start with just framing this period of time. And when most people think about early immigration from South Asia, primarily they're thinking about the period in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And they're usually specifically thinking about immigration by Punjabi Sikh men to the West Coast, to California, Oregon, to Washington State, as well as to the western parts of Canada. So I'd love to maybe start by talking about that period. Seema, could you talk a little bit about how immigration to the United States from South Asia started during that period? And what were some of the factors that led to Punjabi Sikh men deciding to leave India and come to the United States during that time?
Thank you, Sameep, and welcome everyone. And thank you so much for being here today for this conversation. So the period that I focus on is the early 20th century, especially the first 2 decades of the 20th century, on the mostly Punjabi men, the Sikh men who migrated to the Pacific coast of North America. So I include British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And the numbers of South Asians who were officially in the United States in that period, and essentially migration officially kind of ended in 1917 with the Barred Zone Act of 1917. But in that time period, the vast majority, like Sameep said, went to the West Coast and were labor migrants. I think there's been a lot of focus on California and the agricultural workers for good reason, but what's been I think not given as much recognition as it should be is that the initial presence was actually in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington and Oregon. And that was largely a consequence of the British Empire and the fact that many of these South Asians initially were interested in going to British Columbia because Canada was under the jurisdiction of the British Empire. And Canada implemented very severe restrictive immigration laws that largely prevented South Asians from entering as early as 1908 with the continuous journey law. And that is when a lot of South Asian migrants began moving into the Pacific Northwest. And as Paul's story demonstrates, there was, the sort of centrality of anti-Asian sentiment and white supremacist racial violence in the Pacific Northwest really ended up driving out a lot of South Asian migrants who then sort of started making their way south into California. And some of them did go directly into San Francisco, and there's no question about that. But I think that that movement sort of down the Pacific coast as a consequence of imperialism, imperial exclusion, and white supremacist violence really could be more central to the story. And then a lot of the South Asians who were leaving because they were going into debt in Punjab and heard about labor opportunities on the Pacific coast of North America, and so believed that they could come out and work and then send money back home in order to sort of secure their land holdings. So that was true for the vast majority. And then you also had students, and then you had anti-colonial intellectuals who were looking for safe havens from which to organize against the British Empire, and thought that they would be able to find that in the United States. And so many of those anti-colonial intellectuals actually went to New York. Some of them stayed in New York, and then some of them came from New York and made their way out to the Pacific coast.
Seema, you mentioned that it's really 2 journeys that people were taking directly into the United States. Some people had settled in Canada, and then they were traveling into the United States from there. Could you talk about what was that like? Were they able to just walk across it? Like, how were they actually entering the United States? Did they just walk across the border? And what was the journey into the United States from Canada like at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually make an argument in my book that the movement of South Asians across the US-Canadian border contributed to the kind of greater demarcation and enforcement of that border as a way of repressing the anti-colonial movement that these migrants were organizing. So at that time, so we're talking about 1906 till World War I in particular, the border was quite open, one could say. And of course, border enforcement is still in the works at that point. Like the Border Patrol hadn't even been created at that time. And so it wasn't that difficult to move across the border. But one of the things that I found in my research is that British officials and Canadian officials and US officials became increasingly concerned that South Asians were moving across that border very easily. And in doing so, they were circulating anti-colonial periodicals, they were speaking before audiences, and they were building their anti-colonial movement. And so one of the things I discovered in the immigration records is a lot of these officials actually telling immigration inspectors along the border to be more vigilant about scrutinizing South Asian migrants as a way of trying to repress this growing anti-colonial movement in that region.
And for those who are coming either directly from South Asia to the United States or who are initially coming to Canada, could you talk a little bit more about that journey as well? I'm just so curious about, how long did it take them to get there? And then when they came to the United States, it was Angel Island, I believe, that was the first point of entry for those who were coming to the West Coast. What was it like to arrive at that time? What was that journey like, and what was arrival like then?
Well, so Angel Island wasn't established until 1910, I believe. And so prior to that, they were coming, to San Francisco and Seattle. And to be honest, I don't know much about the details of their actual journey. I didn't find a lot of that information in my own research. I found a lot about what it was like when they arrived at the immigration station.
Could you talk about that then?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I could talk about that all day. So I'll try to keep it short. So a couple of things, right? Here's a story of one of the migration patterns that I just loved learning about and writing about. So South Asians, I mean, South Asians obviously came after the Chinese and Japanese had already been excluded. And many of them believed that it wouldn't be too difficult for them to secure a landing and to work, but they had to be crafty with it, because by 1909, 50% of South Asians seeking entry to the US were being excluded under the likely to become a public charge clause. So there was agitation immediately once they started, or I should say very soon after they started arriving, right? The exclusionists already had a kind of anti-Asian campaign and rhetoric established, right? And so South Asians were the next target, but it took them a decade before they actually got an exclusionary policy in the books with the Barred Zone Act. But they were trying to then exclude people who were coming anyway through other measures. And so one of them was migrants would arrive and they would go through the inspection, and the inspectors would say, well, because there's so much prejudice against South Asians in this area, we think that the likelihood of you getting a job is actually quite low, and that you are therefore likely to become a public charge, and we are allowed to exclude you under those terms, and so we're excluding you. And that was true for 50% of those who were arriving. And then there were these strategies where migrants were already here. Taraknath Das is the best example. We're going to the station, the immigration stations, and saying, I have guaranteed jobs right now for 25 migrants. There's no way they're going to become a public charge. Here is their job offer. They should be let go, right? And so they became very contested sites, these immigration stations. And then another example is a lot of South Asians started going to Manila in the Philippines first, and with the idea that we've been admitted to the US. And so then they were showing up in Seattle, especially Seattle, and the inspectors were trying to deny them entry. And they said, we're just traveling from one part of the United States, Manila, to the other part, Seattle. So we've already been admitted, and so you can't legally exclude us. And that generated panic, right, in the Bureau of Immigration, because legally they were right. And legally what they were doing then was trying to deport them, right? And so, they had to use some strategies to try to get in, because there was already a kind of a notion once they arrived at these stations that the goal was to exclude them unless they, that was the purpose rather than the goal, the purpose is to let them in. The goal was we're going to try to keep out as many as we can.
Thank you, Seema. It's so interesting to hear about the creative means that these early immigrants took to actually enter the United States. Could you talk a little bit about how we know what we know about this period of time? Like, are there archival sources? Are there interviews? Like, how did you do this research about this particular period?
Yeah, so this was a long time ago. I mean, this was, and I just want to acknowledge and just say how happy I am to see Vivek Bald here, who I met as a grad when we were both graduate students starting out on this research. And we had a conversation about this, I remember saying, I hope we find something, right? Like we have this idea and I hope we can write it, right? Because I hope we can find the archives. And my advisor, some of my advisors were really concerned that I just wasn't going to find the archival material. And there was one book when I was a graduate student, because Vivek's book wasn't out yet, like all these other books weren't out yet. And so there was one book, and it was Joan Jensen's Passage from India, published in 1988. And I looked at her notes so carefully, and I said, okay, well, she's gone to the DC, so there has to be something there. And she looked at record group 85, the immigration records, and I said, well, I'll just start there, and so I went to DC as a graduate student, hoping that I would find something, and I found so much. And it wasn't what I expected to find, because what I expected to find were immigration records, maybe some publications. What I found was a record of state surveillance, right? What I found was an anti-colonial archive. So I found an archive of radicalism and repression, really. So I started in DC, and I did a lot of stuff in the RG 85, record group 85, and the State Department records and some Justice Department records. And then Canada in Ottawa has amazing records, and the British Library in London. The limitation, of course, was, these are all state archives, right? And the real challenge became, well, what can I find from the actual migrants themselves? And the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley has a collection called the South Asians in North America collection. And that's where they have a lot of their records and publications from the activists themselves. And that was so important. And so it was incredible to find all of that material.
Well, thank you. And I didn't know about that connection that you and Vivek had back then. That's amazing to hear about. Thank you for sharing that. Professor Rajendra Kaur, turning to you now. So as you reveal in this chapter, and I know this is part of your larger work in progress about stories of India and the early American Republic, you write about Sikh Kisar, and this is a history that's 130 or so years before the period that Seema is researching and writing about. Could you talk about how you found that trace of history? Like, what are the records that you were consulting to actually tell that story?
Well, so Sikh Kisar is actually, I was looking at I had started out like Seema, looking at, the immigration on the West Coast, along the West Coast. And then I was interested, on what's happening in the East Coast, and where, in terms of not farmers, but other kinds of migrants, other kinds of movement of people. And I had been reading on the East India trade, what they used to call the China trade, but it was actually, it was in trade with India that all these eastern ports along the eastern seaboard, they were reaping their riches really from India. And I had known about Lascars in the British context, in the European context, because that's where they get talked about. And I was curious as to, well, how were the Lascars, were any of them coming to the US? And then Vivek, I read Vivek's articles on Lascars jumping ship in the 1920s, 1930s. This was long before, Bengali Harlem came out. And then I came across this article by Brunhaus, which was on, Lascars in the US, a sidelight, what he calls a sidelight on the China trade. And I just took off from there because, there are records in the Continental Congress, at the archives in Washington, D.C. And a lot of this is digitized material, Sameep. There's records in the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, And once, once I found those, it was really just like going down a rabbit hole, Alice in Wonderland, because it was one thing to another. And I was looking at the diaries of the principal characters involved, the merchant Lee Hollingsworth, for instance, who was harboring these, Sikh and his men. He was actually hosting them and complaining, about, oh my goodness, how much food do they consume, and and newspapers, local newspapers, because to me it was fascinating that here was a Laskar from Bengal in 1785 petitioning Benjamin Franklin. I thought that was so audacious, and I had, of course, I knew about South Asians, or people from this Indian subcontinent as servants, as slaves, as indentured labor. There are a lot of records on that, and a lot of archives on that, advertisements and petitions, actually, petitions of protest, I call them, dissenting against being enslaved, for instance, in the first place, that they were free men. Uh, and so, the diaries of Lee Hollingsworth, Philadelphia newspapers, and this long saga between, of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., because everybody was trying to hand these men, 35 of them from one government to another. Nobody wanted to be paying for them. And that, that was really fascinating. And then just looking at genealogy records, I find that genealogy websites are amazing resources to trace family names. So those were some of the things that I consulted. Um, the papers of Benjamin Franklin himself. These were other things that I consulted. So um, there's really, if one had I don't think one lifetime is enough to look for this material. I mean, if you think about it, there were so many people from India here, and even as Laskars, Sid Keser is unusual that we find his story. But if you actually look at his petition, on that petition, you'll find the names of all the people who were in his company. And so there are all these Muslim names, Murad, Zahir, and he also talks about his son, who was 12 years old, who was kidnapped. And for a time, I was trying to trace that story. Like, where did that little boy disappear? How was he kidnapped and there were no traces of him? So yes, it's really been it's been fascinating. It's been fascinating to follow some of these traces. And I think each of these is a story in itself, worth telling, because, even if you look at the logbooks of ships, that were engaged in the Yankee Clipper trade, as it was called, uh, you don't find, you can't find traces of people from India, because they were all given Western names by ship captains. So it's only when you look from, country of origin, then you say, okay, it'll say Bengal sometimes, or it'll say the Malabar coast or something. And that's how you can. So it's painstaking work, but, I think there's a huge number of hidden or erased histories that we don't know about, that.
Rajendra, thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, that is so fascinating to hear about that period of time. Vivek, turning to you, you also, are uncovering lost histories in your work with Bengali Harlem. And in the book you write, in our stories, you write about one specific example or one story from 1918. But I would just love to give you an opportunity to talk about your larger project, Bengali Harlem. And if you could talk a little bit more about, what you work on this project and what was bringing these individuals to the United States at that period as well.
Thanks, and it's so nice to be here in everyone's company. I think there's been such a shift just in the last 10, 20 years in terms of just the number of us who are digging into these histories and finding things that have been sitting there right? To be found, waiting to be found. And listening to both Seema and Rajendra speak, I just, there's always these resonances, right, with my own experience. It felt like a rabbit hole to me as well, and I guess to your specific question, I mean, this is, so the project with that focused on or that was the core of Bengali Harlem. I mean, that it really, it started with one story essentially, which was a story told to me by my now collaborator in the film, Alauddin Ullah, about his father Habib, and who had died when he was 12 years old. And when Alauddin first approached me in the late 1990s, he just like came at me like, I want to make a documentary about my father. And his father's story was so unique because, what he knew of his father was that he had come from what's now Bangladesh, from Noakhali district, in the 1920s, and had married a Puerto Rican woman, and had essentially lived out his adult life during the period in which I had come to, like, I had learned was the period in which South Asian migration had stopped, right, between 1917 and 1965. And so, that was originally, it was planned as a film, but since the history that Alauddin's father was sort of pointing towards or raising questions about hadn't been written, that's what actually drove me into graduate school, which I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. But so, and once I started looking into his story, it really started to unravel into something bigger and bigger and bigger. Part of that was, it was a combination of a couple of different types of archive. And one was, literally while Seema was looking at those archives in Washington, DC, I was in London looking at the archives there. And I know that she spent some time there as well at Kew Gardens. And I found the same thing, that like initially looking for ship jumpers, ship workers, I found that the British archives were essentially an archive of surveillance of anti-colonial activities, and that these ship workers were actually involved in those activities, and that they were connecting with people like Sailendranath Ghosh, who was in New York at that time, who was part of an early moment of Bengali militant radicalism in the early 20th century, and who had escaped himself disguised as a sailor to get to New York City, right? And then once he was in New York City, he was connecting with ship workers and providing them with pamphlets, as was the Ghadar Party providing them with pamphlets to circulate. So, the large number of, say, Ghadar pamphlets that made their way back to South Asia and were circulating in Punjab after being printed in San Francisco, that was largely due to ship workers, right? So it was like uncovering, from one thing to the next. And now I forget, your original question actually was slightly different. It was about like the conditions why these men were, I mean, it's very similar to the story that Seema started with, in terms of, the British colonial taxation policies were really negatively impacting small holding farmer families. And so in previous regimes of taxation, there was some amount of flexibility from year to year, depending on the crops, and also there was not a very delineated private property system. When the British came to power, they tried to basically make every parcel of land, create a situation where there was a specific person or family who was responsible for paying taxes for that piece of land, right? And year to year, if there were bad years, they were still responsible for paying those taxes. And so in periods where there might have been 2 or 3 years in a row of drought, more and more these smallholding farmer families, both in Punjab and Bengal, were getting more and more in debt. And in order to fend off the moneylenders and the whoever they were mortgaging their land to, often one or more sons from a family would, in the Bengal case, would go to Calcutta to try to find work in the maritime trade. And so that's how you ended up having a really large number of Bengali Muslim men who were not from Calcutta, but were actually from these more rural areas, coming to the port. That was the largest port city in terms of trade for many, many years, and then getting work on steamships and ending up as this really huge, mobile, but heavily policed workforce that was making their way all over the world through British trade routes, but often very much surveilled and tried, with both local authorities and ships, captains trying to keep them on board. But once again, they found ways, right, of jumping ship, of building networks on land, and then using those networks to find work, onshore. I think I've gone in a few different directions.
Well, no, this is fascinating. Thank you. And so when they came to the United States, it was not just New York City, but also places like New Orleans and along the East Coast, really, that you write about. Could you talk a little bit more about how far that network spread in the United States and how it established itself? You mentioned your collaborator, whose father, I believe it was, himself was an immigrant from Bengal. But are we thinking, is this like a second or third or fourth generation now history of families?
Well, what I found once I started going down that rabbit hole in the archives, and this is also, partly because of, using Ancestry. This period of time, just 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is when a lot of records were being digitized, and Ancestry as a company was kind of like putting it behind their paywall. But it meant that in one location in Ancestry.com, you could look at all kinds of different records, like ships records and census records and, all kinds of things. And so with the New Orleans part of the history, so I ended up thinking I was just looking at ship jumpers or ship workers, but then actually in an old-fashioned archive in New York City, the municipal archives, looking at old reels of microfilm. I started just by looking at marriage records from Harlem and the Lower East Side in the 1920s and 30s, and trying certain kinds of names like Ullah, Uddin, Mia, etc., and coming up with more and more and more of these marriage certificates that would have a Bengali Muslim man as the groom and an African-American or Puerto Rican woman as the bride. But then among those records, there were the records of two brothers, Bahadur and I'm forgetting the second brother's name, Ali, and where their place of birth was listed and their parents' names were listed on the marriage certificates. Their place of birth, one was born in Mississippi and one was born in New Orleans, and their father was named as Muqsad Ali and their mother was named as Ella Blackman. And so that was what turned my attention towards New Orleans. And when I started on, these digitized archives, running similar searches with similar names in New Orleans, I found that starting in the 1880s and 1890s, there was this whole other community of Bengali Muslim men, but from what's now West Bengal on the India side, who were going there as peddlers and peddling, what was then called Oriental goods, and what turned out to be a particular kind of handicraft associated with the region of Hooghly, which is chikun embroidery. And so tracing out that network, again, was another like rabbit hole or another onion or whatever metaphor. And I was able to just trace out the presence of these men in various different locations through the South, and then through what was, I realized, emerging tourist ports in the Caribbean. So Cuba, Panama, other places in the Caribbean, and able to match names eventually, as garbled as they were in the archives, and map this incredible network that the peddlers had created in the midst of the Jim Crow South, and in the midst of, you know, all kinds of obstacles to sell their goods. So yeah, that's sort of the older part of the history that preceded preceded the steamship ship jumpers, but not the earlier ship jumpers that Rajendra has written about.
Thank you so much, Vivek. That's incredible. Paul, turning to you, and now turning back to the West Coast as well, where we started the conversation. You read about the Bellingham riot in chapter 1 of our stories, and you live in Bellingham, actually. And so could you talk a little bit about how you first learned about this history of the Bellingham riot?
Oh, sure. Hello to everyone. I just wanted to interject a little hearing about all these digital searches that a lot of my research has been with the Punjabi Sikhs, and you can't do digital searches very well because they all have the same last name of Singh, and you try to do a digital search for Omar Singh, and you don't know which one of 10 is the one you're looking for, and then they spell them differently in different records. So I'm envious of Vivek's ability to look at Bengalis. Your question, Samit, takes me back quite a few years to 2006, when I was doing some research about civil rights of Asian Americans in general, mostly focused on Japanese and Chinese and the various violent acts up and down the coast. I had a small grant from the state of Washington, and I just saw a paragraph here and there about the Bellingham riot. There wasn't very much known. It was basically the same paragraph in a bunch of books of Asian Americans. And a friend of mine encouraged me to, we talked to one of the local Sikh community leaders about whether they wanted to have some sort of recognition of the 100th anniversary of the Bellingham riot, because we thought, well, maybe they don't want to remind people of this violence, but they were actually interested, and they didn't know much about it at all. And being my field being education, I had the idea, okay, I'll do a little bit of research in the newspaper logs in the Bellingham newspapers, and maybe put out a little 8 or 10 page Xeroxed handout for local teachers. And then, as others have mentioned, with digitization of archives and being able to search, I started finding all kinds of material that the historians who had written about the Bellingham riot in the 1970s and 80s didn't have access to. And some of these finds I actually contributed to SAADA, such as, for example, a letter that I found through a Google search that was in a North Carolina archive of a soil scientist who was in Bellingham at the time of the riot, writing to his mother, and found its way into an archive because his mother and father were important in North Carolina politics and all. So I kept finding more and more, but my original interest was because of the 100th anniversary coming up, and thinking that people in the local area, teachers, college students, et cetera, really ought to know about this, because the Bellingham area is very white, and there have been 3 different occasions where Asian immigrants have been expelled from the Bellingham area, as well as other places in the Pacific Northwest. First, the Chinese in 1885, then the Punjabis in 1907, and then the Japanese in 1942, 43. And it was pretty evident that one reason that Whatcom County, where Bellingham is so white, is because of these violent or threats of violence that expelled people. And the contrast with just across the border in Canada is quite remarkable. The city of Abbotsford, BC, is about 1/3 non-white, mostly Punjabis. And, you know, it's very close to Bellingham. And Bellingham, with all its lumber industry, and agriculture now, where the current Punjabis are very focused with berry production. It would have been really a very inviting place for Punjabis to remain had it not been for the violence. So
thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead.
You know, one of my interests is just how quickly prejudice develops, because in Bellingham, it was only 1906 that the first Punjabis entered, and by September 1907, there was this movement of hundreds of people to kick them out.
Well, you sort of referred to this in your comments, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about it. Is, you know, what is the awareness and recognition of these histories in Bellingham? I know you've been part of some efforts there to help ensure that these stories are reflected, but like, do people know this history in Bellingham? Do they learn about it? Or is there amnesia about this history?
Certainly they didn't know about it much at all before we brought it to the attention for the 100th anniversary in 2007. I think now there's much more knowledge, and we finally, several years ago, erected a monument that reminds people of all three of these exclusions. And it's a beautiful red granite arch that's right across the street from the City Hall and on the public library parkland. And it has plaques reminding people of what happened to the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Punjabis at these three periods that I mentioned. I think it's probably in the nation one of the few multi-ethnic monuments about, you know, civil liberties. So it's hard to know what most people know about anything these days related to civil liberties and civil rights, but I believe that, you know, more teachers are teaching about it. I know I'm in touch with some teachers, instructors at the colleges, and I've given some talks at high schools and middle schools, and you know, certainly there's some interest there, and there are more and more Punjabis going to school here in this county, and they're very interested in learning about it and talking about it. So I think that's also brought some attention. And a couple years ago, Satpal Singh Sidhu was elected as the county executive, and he's one of, I think, the only executives of South Asian descent in the Pacific Northwest. We have also, you know, some legislators, and so he was one of the instrumental people in bringing this to the attention of the community, and also building that arch that I spoke of. So I think
so much.
It's gotten a lot more attention.
Thank you, Paul. I saw that there's a question in the chat for you, Paul. I'll come back to that question in just a minute. I'll make that the first one in our Q&A section. But first wanted to turn to Erica Sarath Anderson. So glad that, Erica, that you could join us today, especially because it's very, very late where you are in Germany right now. And is it close to midnight? Sorry, I should have probably had you go first instead of last. But I'm really grateful to you for joining. You are a living connection to this period of time, because your grandmother was Kartar Dillon, whose excerpt of her story, The Parrot Speak, appears in chapter 1 of our stories. And I thought it would be nice for me and for others as well to just hear about your own stories of your grandmother. Her story is one that certainly inspires me, and I know Niv, and I'm sure many others here. And I was wondering if you could just give us some of the human side of her. Can you tell us about your own recollections of your grandmother?
Sure. Can you hear me, Samip? Can you? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Hello, everyone. This conversation is just fascinating. Thank you to everybody who contributed to chapter 1. That's the one I've read so far. Just fascinating. Well, yeah, I mean, we've been talking so much about the history. It also makes me think about my own historical research that I've done. But let me give you a little background on my grandmother and also the family. To put my grandmother, Car, everybody called her Car. She was born Qatar Kaur Dillon, and everybody just called her Car, K-A-R. So my grandmother, Car, was the fourth of eight children. They were all born in the States because my great-grandfather, Bakshi Singh Dillon, came over first trip 1896 to San Francisco. That was recorded by the San Francisco Chronicle. Actually, they mentioned my great-grandfather by name. And then 1899 was his second trip, and then 1910. And that's when the kids started being born. And they were all born in the States, California mainly, but also Oregon, Astoria, Oregon, speaking of the Pacific Northwest. And I've done a lot of research about the Pacific Northwest. But Car, so the first, what can I tell you? It brings up so much. Well, she was an artist at heart. Thank God she started publishing. She wrote stories all her life. She only had a high school education, never got to college. It was weird, it was a very poor family. They were farm workers. They were migrant farm workers because of the California, alien land law. They were not, Punjabis, Indian people in general were not allowed to own land. So they leased when they were lucky, or they farmed other people's lands. And Car grew up with the family going, California, Oregon, Washington with the crops, whether it was peaches or grapes or whatever, apples in Washington, blackberries. By the time they were in Oregon, Astoria, they were there 1915 to 1922. My great-grandfather was a lumberman. I mean, he worked at the lumber mill. The KKK was extremely active. Paul, you probably know about that. I love to talk to you about the Pacific Northwest sometimes, but the Ku Klux Klan was very active, very racist territory. Mill burned down in 1922. They went back to California. So Car didn't get a chance my grandmother did not get a chance to go to the university, but she wrote stories all her life, and I'm still working through her stories. She also was a wonderful artist, portrait artist with charcoal. In World War II, she learned how to drive a truck, and she drove trucks in the Marine Corps. And before the young men mainly, who would go off to World War II, she would paint their portrait in charcoal. It's like a photograph. I mean, she was really good at it as a portrait artist, and she would send it to their families. Who knew if they'd get back to their families, right? Three of her brothers fought in World War II. So she was an artist at heart and never sort of had the chance. She was a secretary for a union office in San Francisco, but she always wrote and always drew. And finally, when she retired, somebody, I think it was Jane Singh, they published Making Waves, which was a story of Asian American women writers. And they asked Car to submit a story. And she submitted Parrot's Beak, which covered a lot of ground about her relationship with her mother. She was never a favored child of her mother, she felt, and also just the racism against Punjabi Americans, poor people who were at that point migrant farm workers. Yeah, I don't know what else you'd like to know. One time Car was, she was very vibrant. I miss her. She died in 2008 at the age of 94, but at one point she was cleaning out her offices. She said, "Oh, read this, read that, read that." All these, there are a lot of unpublished short stories that I'd like to work through and maybe somehow publish or edit or something. And one of them was a story called Astoria, which is really, so it's a short story, it's a memoir about their time set in 1918. And she remembered when the family, so there were 4 kids at that time, really, the boys were really harassed and ridiculed and beat up because they wore turbans. And I was really taken with that short story. And I ended up working with my grandmother to adapt it to a film that I later made on PBS called Turbans, which was half an hour. And she helped me with the Punjabi. She'd write it in Gurmukhi. She had taught me Gurmukhi. And so then it was crazy. She'd tell me how to say it in Punjabi. She'd write it in Gurmukhi. I'd write it in English. And then I'd tell the actors. It was wonderful. And she came on the set in Astoria. But see, Astoria, Oregon, Paul, you were talking about Bellingham. And another thing about Bellingham, I mean, the unions were really active too. And my great grandfather was really active, like with Greek workers, with Japanese workers, with other workers in these towns. But I went back in 1988 to Astoria, Oregon. We had never been there. And I drove with car. I said, come on, let's go up. Let's try to find where your family was. They were there from 1915 to 1922. So we flew from San Francisco to Portland, rented a car, drove out to Astoria, which is where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean. It's beautiful. And I thought, how on earth are we going to do it? And we stopped at a tourist office, and I just said, my grandmother used to live here in 1915. They were their Punjabi family. He goes, wait a minute, I know the town historian. We found where they used to live and the pipe where she used to, roller skate. And that town had like no trace of all of these Punjabi men and women. They were Punjabi and they were Muslim. They were Sikh and Muslim mainly. And then they were called Hindus, which is totally ironic, of course. And Hindu is spelled, as you all know, Hindoos in most of these newspapers and so forth. But it was a great experience. I made 2 or 3 research trips. I connected with the local historian, Lisa Penner, who worked for, maybe she still does, Oregon Historical Society. She was deeply involved. She helped me. She found the KKK stuff. And she found, that wasn't so pertinent for my family, but I uncovered a lot of history, and the whole town turned out to help me make that film, and housed our crew and fed our crew. It was a great experience. And then we did the premiere there in Astoria. And Cara really enjoyed that project, and she was on set. And she made it real and made the language correct. The first day of shooting, she said, Erica, come here. I had the main girl who was playing my grandmother had no stockings. She was just wearing a dress. It was summer. And Carr said, we never would have left the house without stockings. We never showed bare feet, bare legs, and this kind of authenticity it was just so great to have her there. We filmed in the same town 80 years after the events that was filmed. The events were 1918, and we filmed it 80 years later with my grandmother's help. So it was a wonderful experience. She was an activist her whole life, worked with the Black Panthers, because she was such a great, because she could, what am I trying to say? She would go and donate her time. She would type things up for the Black Panthers, for their educational work, for their schools, for the kids and things like that. And she also donated time and money to the farm workers, because they were farm workers when she grew up. Things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm glad that you talked about your film as well. Is there a way for us to see the film? Is it available still?
Oh yeah, it's available. You could get it from CAAM, Center for Asian American Media in San Francisco. That's part of PBS. You could also get it from Filmmakers Library. They changed their name. Sorry. You could also go to my website, ericasurratt.com, and the information is there and the links. Yeah. But thank you so much for hosting this discussion. It's fascinating.
Thank you so much for being part of it. We just have a couple minutes, unfortunately. And maybe I'll suggest that if you have any questions for our authors, just to add them in the chat. We'll try to find ways to incorporate them into the future meetings. Maybe I'll just have time for one of the questions. Alka, you asked specifically about the Bellingham riots, a question for Paul, whether the riots were strictly motivated by racism. Were there other motivations, like using it as an excuse to take businesses and land? Paul, do you mind speaking to that?
Sure. The Punjabis who were in Bellingham did not have land. They did not have businesses. They were all, the ones who had jobs were working in the lumber mills. The motivation for the riot was a combination of xenophobia, racism, if it you could call it that, as well as labor militancy and, you know, finding scapegoats. The economy was going up and down, and there were times where people were out of work, other times that boomed and they were hiring everyone. So it was very easy for agitators to say, oh, these non-white people are taking away jobs from white people. And so, you know, it's typical trying to split people up. And you know, the one account from a Punjabi that's in Joan Jensen's book is Tuli Singh Joel. And he, talking about this when he was interviewed many, many years later in the 1977 or so, when Joan Jensen interviewed him, he said that they were taking jobs from white people, and that was why they were being attacked. I mean, but you know, it's not really clear that they were, but they were getting hired, and sometimes they were kept on, and maybe there were some white workers who wanted jobs, but it seemed like a lot of it was just labor unrest and looking for scapegoats. And these men didn't speak much English. Some of them didn't speak any English. They looked different. They would get harassed and teased, and then they would fight. So they were seen as violent. Since it was all men, they were seen as immoral because they might look at a woman, a white woman, and, you know, we've seen that in US history, that a non-white man just looks at a white woman and people take offense and accuse them of things. So there are all kinds of ascribed motivations, but I think one could sum it all up as there was just a lot of xenophobia that was promoted by the media, by labor leaders, by the Asiatic Exclusion League, and there were people who were worried about their jobs because there were constant newspaper articles about the tide of turbans and the white peril and all these Japanese and Hindus coming from lands that, you know, where there are just hundreds of thousands who are going to be at our shore. And the ships were pretty full in 1907. When you
I don't know, I think
people
Paul froze.
India.
Oh. Thanks, Paul. You froze for a second, but I think, thank you for sharing that. I'll just, maybe since there was one other question in the chat, turn this to Vivek. There's a question specifically about research of South Asian history in the Midwest. And I'm curious if any of the people that you researched in your work ended up in the Midwest, in Chicago and elsewhere.
Yeah, and that question, I believe, is from Colleen Sen, who's a historian in her own right. So it's good to see you here, Colleen. So what I've found in terms of the Midwest, there was especially with the men who were jumping ship from British steamships. You know, some of them stayed in New York City and worked in the service sector, but there was also, especially starting in the First World War and in the years after, demand for their labor in various different kinds of factories that were further west from New York and from Philadelphia, Baltimore, where they were jumping ship. And so a fairly extensive network kind of built up from men who jumped ship in these eastern ports, but then found work in places like Detroit, in places like Columbus, Ohio, basically wherever there was a steel mill in the Midwest, especially during the First World War when there was a demand for labor. Since a lot of these men were working in engine rooms in the steamships, and so they were used to working with furnaces, and which were essential for steel mills as well. There were even labor recruiters in New York who were kind of funneling these ship workers, both Indian and Chinese, actually, to factory work further inland. And so, I've spoken to one, a grandson of, no, actually son of one of the men who jumped ship in Baltimore in the 1920s. And he described his father as a Rolling Stone type who was kind of moving from one factory to another. And as he started listing the factories that his father went to in the Midwest, it was like rolling off all the places where I'd found little traces in archives. So there was, and it was, so once there was sort of a couple of men in each of these factory towns, it became this network that could be accessed from a port city, and they would know where to go and who to talk to, where the boarding houses were. And so there was this time between the first probably and into and past the Second World War, where there was a certain, kind of steady stream of South Asian ship workers who made their ways to these specific places in the industrial Midwest.
Thanks so much, Vivek. I just want to thank all of you for joining us today, and really thank all of our authors so much for being part of the conversation today, but even more so for helping us to bring this book into the world. So grateful to everyone for their support. And we hope that you'll be able to join us both on November 17th for an announcement about SAADA's future, but then certainly again in January for chapter 2, where we'll look at the period after 1923. So thanks again. Really, this is such a great conversation. I learned so much personally, and I'm really grateful to all of you for being part of it. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.